Hi, everybody. I'm Paul Gorski, and I was very honored to be invited to do a presentation for the symposium about multicultural education. I am, just to give you a little background, I am an associate professor at George Mason University, which is in the United States, close to Washington, D.C., and I teach in a program in social justice and human rights. So my background is in teacher education, preparing teachers, but now my work is a little bit broader, and I work more generally around issues of race, poverty, and other kinds of social justice and human rights concerns. What I'm going to present, what I'm going to talk about in my presentation are 10 principles, 10 sort of basic principles that I think are very important when we're talking about multicultural education or educational equity. Generally, in my work, I have stopped using the language multicultural education for the most part for reasons that I will discuss momentarily. But I tend to focus more on educational equity and principles of equity in a framework that I call equity literacy, which I will also talk about in a little while. But in my little bit of time in this presentation, I want to do a few major things. One is to discuss the 10 principles of educational equity that I think are very important when we're framing our approach to equity and diversity and multiculturalism. But before I do that, I want to talk about two other things. One is some of the gaps that I see between what we say we're committed to in multicultural education and educational equity, and then what we're actually committed to. And then also talk about how I think we sometimes imagine that our major barrier is about practical strategies, that we just need some practical strategies to create a more multicultural learning environment. When really I think the issue is not so much about practical strategies, but much more about ideology, about what I believe. So I want to start with talking about what I'm most interested in my own research and activism and education work, which is about gaps. And I think one of our major barriers is that we sometimes imagine that what we need to do is we all know that we need to create some kind of change, that we need to do something differently. And I think my concern is that there's usually a gap between what we say needs to change on a theoretical or philosophical level, and then what we're actually willing to do in practice to create that change. And so often I think the problem is that we say we're committed to educational equity, but what we're really committed to is something that looks more like celebrating diversity or just acknowledging difference, which is much different from being committed to educational equity. And to give you an example of this, I just want to tell a story about when I was working in a school and also near Washington, D.C. in the United States. And I was helping them do an assessment of how the school was doing when it came to creating an equitable learning environment. So I was doing focus groups, and I did a focus group of some of the students. It was a high school. I did a focus group of African American students. And so I asked them what they thought was going on at the school around diversity, how they thought things were going around diversity. And the students said things like, they said things like, I feel like a visitor at my own school. They said things like, I don't feel included here. I feel like an outsider. And one of the students slammed her fist on the table and said, there's racism at this school and nobody's doing anything about it. And so the way that these young students, probably the people at the school with the least amount of power, the way that they were talking about this issue was that they were experiencing inequities, they were experiencing injustice, and nobody was responding to the injustice. And what they wanted was somebody to address the bigotry and the bias and the inequity that they experienced. Right after that focus group, I went into a focus group with the upper level administrators at the same school, and I started with the same question. What do you think's going on here around diversity? And the head of the school, the principal of the school, leaned back in his chair and he said, what we need to do here is celebrate the joys of diversity. And I thought, aha, that's the problem. The problem is that the people with the most amount of power at this school wanted to think that the problem was just about learning about different cultures and celebrating cultural diversity. And the people with the least amount of power recognized that the problem was much more complicated than that. The problem was that there was inequity and injustice and bias, and that nobody wanted to do anything about it. And what I realized at that moment was that far too much of the energy that we spend when we talk about multicultural education, far too much of the energy is just about culture and not about equity. And I think that is the major shift that we have to make, is a shift from thinking that this conversation is all about culture to understanding that the conversation really has to be about equity. And if we're not addressing equity, if we're not creating an equitable learning environment for every student, then anything that we're doing culturally is a lie, is meaningless. And so we have to make that shift. Secondly, before I get into the 10 principles I want to talk about, I want to mention one more time that I think the reason why this is so difficult, shifting from culture to equity, is because it's not just a problem of practice. I think there are many teachers, there are many educators who really want to create equitable environments for their students. I don't think our problem is really a lack of that. I think the problem is that we have so many people who want to do that, but what they're doing in practice is not consistent with wanting to create an equitable learning environment. And so really, it's not so much a problem of practice, it's a problem of ideology, because what we believe has an impact on everything we do. I'll give you a quick example about, based on research I'm doing about poverty in education. The research in the United States shows that one of the most important predictors of how well a teacher will connect with students who are poor, students who are in poverty, is what the teacher believes about poverty. If the teacher believes that poor students are poor, that their families are poor because their families are deficient, so they blame parents' poverty on the parents themselves, that they don't try hard enough, they don't care about education. If teachers believe that, research shows that they cannot be effective teachers for poor people because they can't believe that poor people are deficient, broken people, and at the same time have high academic expectations for poor people. It's impossible to do both of those at the same time. And this is the same thing. So it doesn't matter how many practical strategies they use to try to make up for that. In the end, if they don't shift their belief system, they cannot be effective teachers for poor people. And I would say the same thing about ethnicity and race and gender and sexual orientation and socioeconomic status, if you believe that your gay and lesbian students are broken, are morally deficient, you cannot be an effective teacher for them. That's the bottom line. And so we have to shift our belief system first, and then our shift in practice is informed by our shifts in belief. And so I'm going to, based on those two sort of fundamental things, I want to talk about 10 principles of educational equity that I think are form the basis of the approach that I'm writing about with my colleague Katie Swalwell, that we're calling equity literacy, because it puts the idea of equity at the center of the conversation rather than culture. So the first principle is related to what I just talked about, that equity concerns are not cultural concerns. Equity concerns are about power and about access and about opportunity. So the resources or the responses that we have to inequity can't be cultural. In other words, if there are, just like the story I told you, if there are students who are experiencing bias and prejudice in the school, to me that's not an issue of culture, that's an issue of inequity. And it has to be addressed as an inequity. And I think part of what throws us off in this whole conversation is that often when we're talking about multiculturalism, we're so focused on culture. I think one of the reasons we're so focused on culture is because people who have the most privilege and the most power can talk about culture and still be very comfortable. But when we start talking about power and we start talking about privilege and we start talking about differences in access and opportunity, then people who are in power start getting a little uncomfortable. And I think that's why we don't talk about that as much. So we have all these models that put culture in the center. We have multiculturalism and interculturalism, cultural competence, cultural proficiency, cultural relevance, cultural responsiveness. And these are the main issues. These are the main frameworks that we use. Again, the problem with those frameworks is that I can be culturally competent, but that doesn't mean that I know how to recognize a subtle inequity or bias in the classroom. And it doesn't mean that I know how to respond to an inequity or a bias. So I need both of those sets of tools. So in other words, I need equity literacy. I need a set of skills that allows me to recognize and respond to inequities, which is not something that cultural competence or cultural proficiency provides to me. So that's the first principle. We need to come at this as an equity issue, not as a cultural issue. Certainly culture is part of the conversation, but it should not be the center of the conversation. The sorts of biases that Roma people and travelers experience in Europe and other parts of the world, that's not cultural. That's about power. That's about inequitable access and opportunity. We call it power because, we call it a problem of culture because that puts the responsibility on disenfranchised or marginalized people rather than putting the responsibility on people with privilege and people with power. So again, equity concerns are not cultural. Equity concerns are about power and access and opportunity. And we need to address these issues as issues of power and access and opportunity. The second principle is that in order to create an authentically multicultural learning environment, we have to get rid of the deficit view or deficit approach or deficit ideology. We have to recognize that outcome inequalities, things like test scores or graduation rates or grade point averages, that outcome inequalities do not result from deficiencies and the cultures of marginalized people. Poor people are not poor because poor people are deficient. Poor people are poor because of inequalities in society. So we can only fix those kinds of educational outcome inequalities if we fix the inequities in access and opportunity. So anytime I start to think, this is why this is a big problem. If I believe that, for instance, poor people don't do as well in school as wealthier people because they're deficient, then when I start imagining solutions to outcome inequalities, I'll only be able to imagine solutions that are about fixing marginalized people. And I won't be able to think of strategies that are about fixing the policies and the practices that marginalize people. So that's a very critical shift as well. So often, and all of us can go back to our schools and look at the kinds of initiatives and practices that we put into place thinking that we're creating a more equitable learning environment. We need to look at those and ask ourselves, what is this initiative meant to fix? If it's meant to fix marginalized people, then we have a problem. Then we're using initiatives that just further marginalize people. If it's meant to fix policies and practices that marginalize people, then we're on the right track. So that's principle number 2. We need to let go of the deficit view, and we need to come up with strategies and initiatives that are not about fixing marginalized people, but instead are about fixing the things that marginalize people. So that's number 2. Number 3 is that, as fun as it might be, celebrating diversity is not enough. Acknowledging diversity is not enough. Celebrating diversity without addressing the inequities and biases that people experience is only adding an additional layer of inequity. And what's even worse is that sometimes we do these celebrating diversity kinds of initiatives, and we're expecting people who experience the school environment as marginalizing to participate in these experiences that really are about helping the most privileged people, the people with the most amount of power, develop their knowledge about diversity on the backs of people who are forced to sort of participate in that despite the fact that they're experiencing inequities in that environment. So there's nothing wrong with doing a multicultural festival. There's nothing wrong with activities that are about people sharing their cultures. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But if we're doing that instead of addressing the inequities, if we're doing that and ignoring the inequities, then it's a problem. And if we're doing that and expecting marginalized students to participate, then it's also a problem if we're not also addressing the inequities. Oftentimes, celebrating diversity, I think, really is for people who are already in a privileged position, because that's the easiest way to pretend like we're doing multiculturalism, to do the multicultural arts and crafts, to do the diversity fair, but to ignore the inequity. So that's number 3, getting past celebrating diversity and, again, focusing on equity. Principle number 4 is really about how do we understand how equitable the learning environment is. The principle that I go by when I work with schools is that our schools are only as equitable as the most marginalized people experience them to be. And that's why we have to do more research on opening spaces, creating spaces for marginalized voices to be heard, to create some counter narratives to the sorts of things that people generally are saying about marginalized communities. So we have to think about what that means when we create, for instance, if I work in a school and I'm trying to create an opportunity for families to come offer feedback or to get involved, I have to think about how I'm doing that, because so often I create these opportunities with the best of intentions, but I create them with a set of assumptions about who has access to participate in them. So if I'm creating opportunities for parents to come and share their views, but I'm doing it in a way that doesn't make sense for parents who are much more likely to be working multiple jobs, much more likely to be working evening jobs, less likely to be able to afford childcare, less likely to have transportation, and also for people who are much more likely to have experienced school as a hostile environment when they were going through school, then I'm really not creating, I'm really just recreating the inequity that exists in society. So I have to think about how I create those opportunities, and I have to make sure I base the initiatives that around equity not on what makes the most privileged people safe and comfortable, but what the most marginalized communities are saying that they need, the kind of change that they need, things that they need to happen in the school to create more equity for themselves. So again, that was the fourth principle, that our schools are only as equitable as the most marginalized people experience them to be. And if we want change toward more equity, we need to base that on the experiences of marginalized people, not on the ways that the conversation often is framed by the people with the most amount of power. The fifth principle is based on the idea that, so much of the work that exists around educational equity and social justice education and diversity and multiculturalism is based, unfortunately, on things that are simply popular or sound like they ought to work. What we lack is enough of a sort of research base to really understand the initiatives at work. Now, when I say research base, I want to be clear about this. I'm not talking about necessarily, I'm not talking about simply kind of a Eurocentric model of quantitative research. I'm talking about, there's all different kinds of ways to do research and to collect data and analyze data. And I think we need to take advantage of all of those, and even maybe even especially narrative kinds of research that collect the stories that have been passed down about what works and what doesn't work in different communities. So that, I think, we need to see as just as legitimate of research, and look at all of it. And we have to really focus on what works instead of what's popular. Instead of looking at, oh, well, that school's doing that, or this person who I really like wrote a book and said that this sort of thing should work. If there's not evidence that it works, the stakes are way too high just to start putting things into practice. And there are a couple examples in the United States of this, where people have put a lot of resources into initiatives that sound good, but really there's no evidence that they worked. For instance, people who cared about diversity for a long time were really focused on learning styles, that we really need to understand the African American learning style and the Latino learning style and the male learning style and the female learning style. And they thought this was the way to diversity, make sure everybody was included. The problem is that when we started looking at research about this, what we found was that that approach was completely problematic. One reason it was problematic was because there is no African American or Latino learning style. That the learning styles that African American people have are extremely diverse. Same with Latinos, same with men, same with women. But the second thing is, research started to show that teaching the specific learning styles was simply not effective. It was not an effective way to teach because people learn differently based on what they're learning, right? So we need to find out what works. We need research on what works, and we need to adopt strategies that work, because the stakes are way too high just to be putting stuff into practice because someone in the school next door is doing it. So that was principle number 5. Develop initiatives and strategies based on what works, not on what's popular. And, number 6 is that equity concerns are intersectional. In other words, if I want to create equity across gender, I can't do that effectively if I'm not also creating equity across ethnicity or across religion. I don't get to pick and choose. If I start picking and choosing, I will do equity across class, but I'm uncomfortable talking about homophobia and sexual orientation, then that's not equity. If you're making that choice, what that means is that you are an inequitable educator. We don't get to pick and choose. It's either equity or it's inequity. So that means we have to be committed to equity for all marginalized students. And as soon as we start picking and choosing, then we're not doing equity for anybody. If I'm talking about Muslims, there are gay Muslims. So I can't create an equitable learning environment for all Muslims if I'm not creating an equitable learning environment for gay students. Right? So same thing, we have to make sure that we're using an intersectional approach that understands identities as intersecting and that responds to inequity as intersecting. So that was number 6. We have to take an intersectional view, and we either create equity for all marginalized students, or we're really not creating equity for any marginalized students. Number 7 is that we have to recognize that educational equity movements are connected to other movements for equity. And one of the sort of divide and conquer themes that you can often see in activism around social movements is the way that different movements are kind of splintered from each other. But I need to see how these different movements need each other and feed into each other. So think about environmental justice. Think about the environmental hazards that are much more likely to cause problems to your most marginalized students, to low-income students, for instance. That has an impact on their ability to engage at school and to learn. And so you see that intersection. Or think about access to healthcare and how much that has an impact. So people who are doing things about medical healthcare access, people who are doing things about environmental justice, people who are doing racial justice work outside of education, people who are doing feminist work outside of education, people who are doing human trafficking work. All of this is tied together, and we need to understand it as tied together and start building coalitions that can work on these issues together and take advantage of each other's expertise. And so I would call for a bigger level of solidarity across all movements for equity, that we refuse to allow each other to be splintered so that we look like a bunch of little movements that are competing with each other for resources. I think we need to work together and create a bigger movement. So that was principle number 7, to see educational equity concerns as connected with other equity concerns and start building solidarity with people working on those other equity concerns. Principle number 8 is that, unfortunately, so much of what we do in terms of equity work in schools is focused on what I would call mitigating inequity rather than transforming inequity. Now, I come out of an activist world, and in that world we talk about sort of a continuum of activism. On one end of the continuum is mitigative approaches. Those are approaches that, for instance, if we're talking about students who are in poverty, mitigative approaches would help students in poverty be a little more comfortable or have a little bit more access as students in poverty. A transformative approach would be, what we need to do is really eliminate poverty, right? Thinking about that in terms of education, it's not how do we help low-income students do a little bit better on standardized test scores. It's the transformative approach might be something like, we have to recognize how this imposition of standardized tests is having such a negative impact on low-income students. And so we have to eliminate the factors in education, the corporatization or privatization of schools that is resulting in these neoliberal school reforms, such as high-stakes testing, that's having the most immediate negative impact on our most marginalized students. So instead of doing all these mitigative things, we need to think, how can we transform the system itself to be more equitable, instead of how do we make little shifts within an inequitable system to sort of help marginalized people conform to the system that's inequitable. So shifting from that mitigative approach to a more transformative approach. Number 9 is that I think another issue that I see often is that the equity work in schools is driven by people who see themselves as experts, either because they've worked in schools for a long time or because they are a professor of education or for whatever other reason. And I think what happens too infrequently is collaborations between people like that and people in communities. So I think shifting the understanding of who the expert is in educational equity from people who are theorists, from people who just happen to teach in a certain community, to people who are actually embedded in that community. And so to me, that shift is, I often hear like people talk about, I'm going to do this for poor people, or I'm going to do this for gay and lesbian people. What I say is that my educational equity work is, that was my little cat just walking by the screen there. I hope everyone saw him. You can still see his little tail there. His name's Buster. So everyone say hi to Buster. So my way of thinking is that my responsibility is not to go into other communities and create change, to think I know what needs to be done, but instead to build relationships with people in communities and to work in the service of those communities. The communities are the experts of their own schools. So I think that is a really important shift, that I will work with or in service to marginalized communities, but I am not in a place to speak for marginalized communities or to decide what marginalized communities need. Too many people, especially people from academia, do that. And it's another way that marginalized communities are further marginalized. So that was number 9, engaging marginalized communities as the leaders in these conversations. Lastly, number 10 is the need for people who are in privileged positions. So in the US, somebody in the United States, somebody like me who's white, male, mostly heterosexual, people assume that I'm Christian even though I'm not Christian, so I guess I get some privilege there as well. And those sorts of things. Hi, Buster. I know. So, so that as somebody who inhabits those privileged identities, that I have an extra level of responsibility, and I call it institutional likability, that I can go in and fight for change and not have people just make the assumption that I'm being selfish or I'm doing, work for my own. People don't have those racist views of me in the United States as a white person. And so I don't And so this gives me an opportunity, and more than that, it gives me a responsibility to make myself responsible and to make myself vulnerable, and not to wait for people of color to make themselves vulnerable. Racial justice has to be my issue. Gender justice has to be my issue. And ending heterosexism and homophobia has to be my issue. I have to take responsibility for that. Because I have been given the privilege and the power and what I call the institutional likability to be able to do that without having such a high potential of losing my job or other sorts of implications that people might experience. So those are my 10 principles for moving toward an authentic version of educational equity. I hope that this spurs useful dialogue at the symposium. Feel free to email me or to check out my website. You can go to my website at edchange.org and contact me through that if you want and continue the conversation. Thank you again for the organizers. I was very humbled and proud to be invited to participate in this symposium. And I guess Buster was equally excited and enthusiastic to participate as well. Thank you all. Bye-bye.